What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be ranking the albums of the legendary extreme metal band Deceased. So when I first started this channel, there were a few bands on my list that I was especially excited to make a video about, and Deceased was right at the top of that list. Everything about this band just really resonates with me, from their eclectic mix of death metal, old school heavy metal, and thrash metal, to their vintage horror movie inspired lyrics, to the underground metal spirits embodied by their vocalist and founding member, King Fowley. This is just an amazing band that everyone needs to listen to in my book. King actually formed the band way back in 1985 in the lovely city of Arlington, Virginia, and he would actually serve as the band's vocalist and drummer at the beginning, and he would continue filling that role as the drummer for the band's first few albums. After a few demos in the early 80s, Deceased would be the first band ever to sign to Relapse Records, who would release their 1991 debut, Luck of the Corpse. So Deceased said one of their goals with the band was to out-thrash Slayer, and I think this album definitely gives me the impression that it was created by diehard 80s metal fans who really sought to go more extreme than the stuff they grew up on. Compared to later Deceased albums, this definitely has much more of a straightforward death metal focus, almost giving me kind of like Autopsy vibes at times. King, for example, uses a really gurgly death growl that would contrasts pretty sharply with the gruffer shout that he would come to use on later albums. I would also say compared to later albums, this album definitely does feel a bit more amateur to me. The drumming, for example, feels a little bit sloppy, but I think that kind of adds to the album's rustic charm in a way. I think also contributing to the enjoyability factor of this album for me is just how packed these songs are with really thrashy riffs and maniacal energy. You especially hear that on songs like The Cemetery's Full and Experimenting with Failure, but at the same time, they're still able to conjure a really dense and musty atmosphere, which I think comes from the raw production, but also the songs themselves. The opening track, Fading Survival, for example, has these really frantic and brutish riffs, but then it breaks partway through for some clean picking that just makes things feel a little eerie. I also like how, despite this album's more primitive feel, it still manages to work in some almost progressive ideas at times, like in the songs Psychedelic Warriors and Birth by Radiation, which use some off-kilter rhythms and some clean picking to really good effect. Futuristic Doom likewise has some spacey leads that are kind of neat and make it stand out. I will say overall, Luck of the Corpse does feel a little bit unfocused on times, like it doesn't quite tie everything together as neatly as it seems to want to, but that being said, it's definitely a fun ride overall. I think Deceased would get a lot better as songwriters and musicians, but this is a really enjoyable debut to me. Not necessarily stylistically similar to what they would do later, but still a fun early death metal album. I'll put it here on the still really good tier only because I want to leave plenty of space above for their later albums, which is where I think they would really hit their stride. Alright, so following Luck of the Corpse, Deceased would return in 1995 with their second album, The Blueprints for Madness. This record would actually mark the full-length debut of guitarist Mike Smith, who replaced original guitarist Doug Souther, who appeared on the Luck of the Corpse album. Overall, The Blueprints for Madness definitely has a more balanced production with a little bit more power to the drums than the guitars. I'd say also the musicianship has generally improved on this album, and I think you hear that right from the opening track, Morbid Shape in Black. This song features kind of a tension-building intro and some interesting chords that kind of sound different from anything you heard on the last album. In terms of further developments, there's a lot more melodic ideas here as well. The Triangle, for example, is this really great song that uses this halftime melodic riff partway through to really great effect. Some of the ideas in the songs Island of the Unknown and the closing song A Reproduction of Tragedy are also highly melodic, and I think would kind of foreshadow what the band would start to do on some of their later albums. At the same time though, while I think the Blueprints for Madness definitely showed that Deceased were getting better as musicians, I don't think that was universally true because I do think the drumming is still a little bit sloppy here for my taste. The other thing about this album too is I don't think they necessarily got better at writing songs. The tracks here are generally longer than the ones on the debut, and the writing just feels a little bit more unfocused to me, with a lot of ideas that are kind of stitched together but not always in the most cohesive way. Morbid Shape in Black kind of has that issue a little bit, but a lot of the songs throughout the album kind of do, and it kind of makes these tracks just sort of blend together for me, more so than really any other Deceased album. It doesn't help either that at 52 minutes, this is significantly longer than the debut, which came in around 36 minutes. I think with that longer runtime and the sheer amount of ideas, this definitely feels more ambitious than the first album, but it also feels like it doesn't coalesce as well, and it just lacks that musty mystique to me too. Because of all that, I'd feel pretty confident calling this my least favorite Deceased album. Still not a bad release, but beaten out by pretty much everything else in their catalog to me. Alright, so following the Blueprints for Madness, Deceased would return in 1997 with their third album, Fearless Undead Machines. Anyone who's a fan of Deceased knows that Fearless Undead Machines is Deceased's breakthrough album. This is the first record where their signature style really first appeared. King starts using more of a gruff shout here as opposed to the death growl he used on the earlier albums. There's also a lot more melodic and old school heavy metal elements really coming into play here. The opening track, The Silent Creature, is a really great example of that. This song just does a fantastic job combining death metal with galloping heavy metal riffs, powerful thrash breaks, energetic melodies, and just these really wild solos for an amazing ride. I get similar vibes from the title track and the song Night of the Deceased. All three of these songs are pretty long at about 8 minutes, and to me, they kind of form an epic trio early in the album. These 3 tracks are pretty much all signature Deceased songs at this point that are still played live often to this day. And I think these tracks show that not only did the songwriting get better as well, but so did the playing, with everything here just sounding quite a bit tighter than the last 2 albums to me. I also like the way this album's arranged with those 3 really strong songs placed right at the beginning of the album with an interlude separating each one of them. These interludes are also great too, with Contamination being particularly notable in my book, with some fantastic spoken word that really hammers home that this album is supposed to be a homage to old school zombie movies. I do think a lot of people like Fearless Undead Machines because it was the first Deceased album where their trademark sound would be shown, but I do have to say, listening to it with a critical ear, it's not necessarily perfect. After Night of the Deceased, I don't necessarily think there's a whole lot of standout moments on the rest of the album. It's consistently good and often great, but I think those 3 songs near the beginning of the album just kind of overshadow most of the other stuff here. That said, I do want to mention the songs Graphic Repulsion and Mysterious Research, both of which work in some maniacal riffing that kind of remind me of the stuff you heard on the first 2 albums. The Psychic, which is the second to last song here, is also a really cool song. Possibly one of the most melodic songs here, with some great leads, really wild riffs, and I just really wish a lot of the songs in the second half of this album were more like this song. At 68 minutes, this is the longest Deceased album, and I think it's probably just a little too long for its own good. A more concise runtime definitely would have helped. But that being said, it's still a great album. It has some of their best songs on it. It's so enjoyable to listen to front to back, even if I don't necessarily pull out of a lot of songs from the second half of the album, for my playlists or whatever. It's not their best, but it's definitely one of their best. I'll put it at the fantastic tier, but definitely an album worth owning, definitely one worth listening to, definitely one of the best Deceased albums. Alright, so following Fearless Undead Machines, Deceased would return in the year 2000 with their 4th album, Supernatural Addiction. Supernatural Addiction definitely shows Deceased continuing to evolve. They would refine their songwriting more, they would continue becoming more melodic, and I think you hear that right from the opening track, The Premonition. This track has a really addictive main melody, and is one of the first songs in Deceased's catalog that has this really identifiable chorus that is just so catchy. I love the way King just goes, that shadow on the wall. It works just great live, too. Something about the production on Supernatural Addiction I think really makes these riffs and songs just pop out a lot more. And the other thing too about this album is that it just feels a lot more varied. The songs do a much better job of developing their own identity and standing apart from one another. Dark Chilling Heartbeat, for example, has these tightly wound tremolos and these battering chords, and then it uses some of the most extravagant leads the band have used yet. It's fantastic. A Very Familiar Stranger is one of my favorite Deceased songs. I love those tight melodic riffs and then the twirling harmonies that almost make it sound like Iron Maiden playing death metal. This song also has a fantastic guitar solo, and I love how it's coupled with this shout of King just going, I told her to cherish her spirit, she just sat and cried at the grave. Every time I hear that coupled with a guitar solo, I just get goosebumps. The Hanging Soldier is a great song with these really snaky leads. Chambers of the Waiting Blind kind of mixes things up with some piano incorporated into it. And then you have the closing track, Ellie's Dementia, which kind of shuffles forward with these echoing notes. It's a very minimalist composition, but I think it works and really sets itself apart from a lot of the other stuff here. I think Supernatural Addiction really just packs in everything that makes Deceased great, from the thrashy energy to the melodic hooks to the creepy atmosphere. This album to me is where it all just came together and they really nailed it. Definitely goes in the best tier. Probably my favorite Deceased album. Absolutely fantastic. Absolute classic. Hands down, excellent album. Alright, so following Supernatural Addiction, Deceased would leave Relapse Records in 2003 and release their follow-up album, As the Weird Travel On, in 2005 via Thrash Corner Records. So a bit of a lineup shift here. Dave Castillo would join on drums, and King Fowley would shift to solely doing vocals for this album. Compared to prior albums, I would say As the Weird Travel On has a great production, probably the most clear sound yet. Stylistically, it continues to evolve from Supernatural Addiction with, I would say, even more melodic approach than that album had. Yet at the same time, I think what really sets As the Weird Travel On apart from the other albums in Deceased's catalog is that this record is very fast, very thrashy, and probably more aggressive than anything else they had done previously. The band would really forgo slower tempos on this album, and they would kind of step back from some of the more reflective ideas that they would occasionally use on prior albums. And while I think those changes give this album a little bit less atmosphere, there's still some really strong songs here. The opening track, The Kept, for example, just charges forward with this relentless energy that's also found in a lot of the other tracks here. This song has some great melodic riffs and almost this southern fried riff that kind of reminds me of Ark Hoslant, but without the baggage that comes along with that band. Unwanted Memories also stands out with these really rich harmonies that are played very fast during the chorus. A Visit from Dread is probably the catchiest song here. There are a lot of great songs here, from the closing track, Fright, to the song The Funeral Parlor's Secret. And this was also the first Deceased album I ever heard, so I definitely do have a soft spot for it. But I'd say my biggest criticism with As the Weird Travel On is that with how relentless it is, the songs don't necessarily feel super different from each other, especially compared to the last album. With everything charging forward so much, it kind of blurs together a bit by the second half, and becomes a little fatiguing, especially with the 48-minute runtime. That being said, I really do love this album. I have it on CD and vinyl. I still listen to it often. For a while, to me, it was the signature Deceased album, but I think listening to it in the context of their catalog, As the Weird Travel On, just gets outperformed a little bit by the other records in their discography, mainly because I don't think a lot of their other records have that same fatiguing feel that kind of crops up with this, and makes this album feel a tad homogenous at times. This is still an excellent album that I recommend everyone check out, but in the context of Deceased's catalog, I do think there are stronger Deceased albums. I'll put it in the middle excellent tier, and I feel pretty good about that. Alright, so following As the Weird Travel On, Deceased would return in 2011 with their album Surreal Overdose. So starting with this album, guitarist Shane Fugel would replace longtime guitarist Mark Adams on guitar, and King would actually go back to doing drums on this album, which was interesting. This record definitely continues with that fast, thrashy energy from the last album, but I think it has some things about it that really make it an improvement over As the Weird Travel On to me. One, I would say Surreal Overdose is actually quite a bit less melodic than As the Weird Travel On was, with this album kind of relying more on fast, triumphant riffs that actually just end up feeling more interesting to me than some of the ideas on the last album. Skin Crawling Progress, for example, just has these wild and frantic riffs that are mixed with epic chords, and it just makes for a really fun and crazy ride that kind of reminds me of the maniacal energy on the first two albums. Kindred Assembly also uses fast, triumphant riffing to great effect. They also did an entirely abandoned melody on this album, and when that melody does show up, I think it's just more notable. Cloned Day of the Robot, for example, has some great melodies that really make for a really strong chorus. They also still managed to work in a little bit of atmosphere with that late album instrumental, A Doom-Laden Aura, which leads into the fantastic closing song, Dying in Analog. The other thing, too, about Surreal Overdose is I think it's just sequenced really well. The songs stand out more, and it just works really well as an album. At 45 minutes long, it's got the most concise runtime of any of their post-Luck of the Corpse albums, and to me is just an outstanding all-around release. It's extremely close to Fearless Undead Machines in my book, but I think Fearless Undead Machines does beat out Surreal Overdose just because Fearless Undead Machines has some of Deceased's most signature songs. That said, this is still a fantastic album, one of my favorites from the group, and an absolute must-listen for any fan of this band or death thrash metal in general. Alright, so following Surreal Overdose, Deceased would sign to Hell's Headbangers Records and release their seventh and latest album, Ghostly White, in 2018. So Dave Castillo would return on drums for this album, but unfortunately he would actually pass away about a week before this album was released. Rest in peace. That said, I would say his performance really shines here, and honestly this album as a whole is just incredible. Compared to the last two albums with Ghostly White, they really dialed back on the straightforward thrashiness, and I think you hear that right from the opening track, Mrs. Allardyce. This song just rides this big, crunchy, mid-tempo riff that has so much power to it, and then has these huge, dramatic melodies throughout that just make for a really outstanding song. This track and the album as a whole, I would say, just feel really intricate and layered. There's so many harmonies and solos and squealing melodies here. I think that's all probably best showcased on the 13-minute epic Germ of Distorted Lore. This song is so haunting and adventurous, and while it is a little bit repetitive, I think it's nonetheless just an outstanding song and one of the highlights of Deceased's catalog. I also love the melodic riffs and female vocals on the closing track, Pale Surroundings, which has probably become one of my favorite Deceased songs. Again, it is just so catchy and so haunting. Ghostly White also has a lot of hooks that just cut really deep, like on the song To Serve the Insane, which has this jumpy melodic riff that just meshes so well with the way the vocals are performed during the chorus. It's really one of the best hooks in the band's career. The Shivers kind of gives me similar feelings with its echoing leads and spoken word during the chorus, which works so well. And it's pretty cool to hear them incorporating elements like that, especially this late in their career. The other thing about Ghostly White is that the songs just complement each other really well. Like how you have the short thrashy track, A Palpitation's Warning, coming right after the long epic Germ of Distorted Lore. Like a lot of the best Deceased albums, there's also just so much atmosphere here. It's a very dark and mysterious feeling album, and you just feel like you're getting engulfed by its mystical world when you listen to it. Yeah, overall with this album, it's well sequenced, the songs are great, the atmosphere is great. And while I have seen some people say that the songs could be more concise because they do get a little repetitive sometimes, I do think that's probably my only quibble with this album. Every time I listen to this album, it's just continued to grip me more and more, and it's grown on me so much since I first listened to it when it came out. There are some days where I consider this my favorite Deceased album, but yeah, to me, I'd call it a close second to Supernatural Addiction, but these two are really close. Absolutely fantastic album, and so cool to see they release such a great record this late in their career. But yeah, that's my Deceased ranking. So they did announce that their next album will be called Children of the Morgue and will be released via Hell's Headbangers Records. They obviously do take a while to release albums, so there's no official word on when that'll come out yet, but hopefully we'll see it sooner rather than later. There's also a documentary in the works about King Fowley, which would be really cool to see. And Deceased is still active live and still puts on awesome shows, so I definitely would recommend checking them out if they come to your town. But that'll do it for this one, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think of Deceased. Let me know how you'd rank their albums. Let me know what you think of my rankings. And if you like this video, please subscribe, please drop me a like. And if you want to see me talk about more metal, check out this video over here where I rank the albums of Destroyer 666. But that's all for now. Thanks as always for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week. Stay heavy.